Welcome, friends of the Arboretum. I've been around long enough to remember a time when herbaceous perennials were cut down as soon as there was frost. The whole perennial gardens or the perennials in mixed plantings were cut down. And we're talking about herbaceous perennials, the plants that lack permanent woody stems. So not trees or shrubs, but the herbaceous perennials. But in quite a few decades now, we've come to see the beauty of the winter forms of many herbaceous perennials. I think the ornamental grasses were the first ones to make us realize that the winter forms of some herbaceous perennials are very beautiful all winter long. I think the traditional habit of cutting the herbaceous perennials down after frost came from possibly two different ideas. One being that when you cut them to the ground and discard the tops of the plants, you might be getting rid of any insect pests. I think that might be important in a vegetable garden or in an orchard or something, but in the perennial garden, we're not bothered by insects for the most part. And indeed, any plant that routinely and regularly was bothered by insects, pests, we'd probably no longer grow it. We'd eliminate it from the garden. Probably the only plant that we still put up with insect pests are the cannas, because there's few other plants that have their big, bold, and often colorful foliage. So it's none of this is black and white. And if you want to go out and cut your entire garden to the ground, now that we've had a hard frost, it's your garden and you're welcome to do that. But I encourage others to take a moment and begin to see the beauty of the seed heads and stems of herbaceous perennials in the winter months. There are some things we cut down, cannas being one of them, because they're not very beautiful after frost. Well, no, they're ugly after frost, and it is the one example where cutting them down might lessen the amount of canna leaf rollers we have in the subsequent summer. So you get to go through your garden and ask yourself whether something pleases you or not. There are some things that are really beautiful in the winter months, but we cut down this time of year because if we leave them, we get far too many seedlings. And we'll see a few of those as we go through the garden. So it's sort of a judgment call on each type of herbaceous perennial in the garden. Another reason to cut down is if you've integrated winter and early spring flowering bulbs in a summer perennial border, well, you'll want to cut down some of the summer things sooner so those winter and spring flowering bulbs aren't hidden by the summer foliage. A good example would be Crinums. Crinums pretty much completely disappear in the winter, leaving about 6 feet of bare ground. But some of the little bulbs, such as starflower, Iphion, can be planted in between the Crinums, and they sort of are subletting the same space. So the Crinums are slow to go down when frost is late, but things like the starflower, the Iphion, has foliage already, so we might cut those Crinums down even before frost cuts them down. It doesn't hurt the plant to cut them down ahead of a killing frost, because when we get a killing frost is very variable. So if we cut those things down earlier, it's just as if we had a killing frost earlier than the actual time. What tools do we use? Well, a good pair of pruning shears is the tool I use most often. For smaller things, I often use my pocket knife if they're not too woody. Some things that are very soft, like daylily foliage or crinum foliage, a good pocket knife is a very useful tool. I usually keep my sharpening steel in the car so I can, make a sharper edge to the blade. And you can use long-handled loppers, which are just like the pruning shears with long handles. But when I need a tool to cut bigger things or woodier things, I much prefer a small folding saw, because whereas the loppers I have to set down on the ground and then go back and find them when I need it, the little folding saw I just put in my pocket when I'm not in use, and so it's always right at hand. And most of the herbaceous perennials don't need a pruning saw, but some things that are very fibrous, like cannas, especially after they've been frozen hard, cut better with a saw than with a pruning shear, which tends to just mush them. Or, the big stems of the herbaceous hibiscus are easier to cut down with the pruning saw than with the pruning shear. We don't cut the hibiscus down till late winter because they're actually fairly handsome through the winter months, especially the wild types with their seed heads. So I mentioned cannas. This is great big banana leafed canna, and it doesn't look too bad, but most of the other cannas look really raggedy once we've had frost. So we'll cut those down. They're not at all woody, they're soft. So I'm able to cut them down with the pruning knife, with my little pocket knife. They're soft. Couple more hard frosts and they'll be mushy. Right now they're still sort of crisp, so they're actually somewhat easier to cut down. Yes, sir?
Doug, somebody mentioned since you talked about them getting mushy, somebody mentioned that they like to use an old serrated bread knife.
Okay.
You ever do that?
No, I haven't, but that's, I'm always happy to hear about other people's tools. And I mentioned, using a pruning saw when the cannas get mushy, because it'll cut through the fibers. They have long fibers like a stalk of celery, and the pruning shears, when the canna stems get mushy, tend to just sort of gum them up. But whereas their bread knife or pruning saw will cut through those fibers, especially if you pull up on them like you do when you're cutting a piece of string. You make sure it's good and taut. I should close one tool at a time. I'm determined to still have 10 fingers at the end of this class. Okay. The little Ruellia has turned black with last night's frost. It could stay if you wanted to. It's not too shabby, but it also could be cut down at this time. I like to cut things low to the ground. When you leave an inch or several inches of stem, they tend to trip me as I'm walking through the garden, so I like to just cut them down. These little garlic chives are still green, but a few more hard frosts and they're going to turn to mush. I also find that the garlic chives and daylilies with their soft foliage will often harbor aphids, so I like to clean the foliage away sooner than later, just to get rid of any aphids that might spend the winter there. And I'm just sort of skimming off the foliage with the little pocket knife. The Monarda, the bee balm, often it can be showier in winter, but these look a little bit raggedy. Don't quite know why. But their stems are very brittle, so you could just snap them off by hand. And we have here a great big clump of Crinums. And Crinums are a little bit different than a lot of things, a lot of bulbs, in that the long neck of the bulb remains alive above ground. So when you cut back Crinums, you don't cut them all the way to the ground. If you forget and you cut them all the way to the ground, they'll be fine. But following what the plant tells you, I'll clear away a little bit of foliage and you'll be able to see what I'm talking about. This foliage has been killed by last night's mid-20s or lower, but these necks of the bulbs will not die to the ground over winter. So it's probably best if they're not cut to the ground, because when you cut them to the ground, you're cutting part of the actual bulb away. They're not a thing of great beauty in the winter garden. But we put up with them because that's the nature of these plants. Crinums will often grow during extended mild spells in late winter, early spring, and then when it turns cold again, that new growth will get destroyed by the frost, and then you end up with what I call the snotty noses of a crinum, where the top of the bulb has this browned foliage that is now, you have to sort of peel it away so the new growth can come through it. But once the old, this summer's foliage is cleared away, you could plant little winter and spring flowering bulbs around them that will grow while the crinum's dormant. Ornamental grasses. Majority of the ornamental grasses we grow are real showy in the winter. This is the giant cane, Arundodonax. It's the cultivar peppermint, and you can see lower down on the plant where the foliage hasn't been destroyed by frost yet, that even in the last days of it having green foliage, it's still brightly variegated, which sets it apart from the old cultivar versicolor, which was brilliantly variegated in the spring, but then by midsummer was green the rest of the growing season. But they will shed all these leaves. They look rather shabby now, but they'll shed all those leaves, and then you'll have the tall stems with the big plumes at the top. Some of the ornamental grasses that bloom through the summer months are shabby by winter, so those ones we do tend to cut down this time of year because they're not attractive any longer. But the majority of the ornamental grasses are late summer and fall blooming, and they tend to stay really showy through the winter months. The purple muley grass, this is probably the species Muhlenbergia philippes, which is very much like Capillaris, but it's a taller, later blooming species, and it's fairly attractive through the winter months. But further on at the end, you can see the giant miscanthus, and that's really beautiful all winter long. Here's an example of a plant that we do cut down earlier, even though they're really pretty through the winter months. This is ironweed, which is Vernonia, And, like their Vernonia is in the Aster family, but so is dandelion. And you see these little seed heads are like the little seed heads of dandelions, and the seeds are dispersed just like dandelion seeds are. They sort of float away with the little pappus that supports the seeds. And then what you're left with is the receptacle, which looks like a little silvery tan flower in its own right. And they're very beautiful all winter long, but we get so many seedlings from the seeds that are dispersed that we tend to cut it down, this time of the year, so we have fewer seedlings to weed out come spring. Behind us here is Lantana. It's no longer in bloom because of the frost we've had, and they start to grumble once the weather turns chilly anyway, long before we have a hard frost. And there is this idea that some of the lantanas and other things that are half-hardy, that they will overwinter more readily if they are not cut down. I don't know of anybody who's actually done good science on that subject, where maybe they planted out 20 plants and 10 were cut down and 10 weren't, and compared how many of those survived. Is anyone aware of any research that way? Because I know in some instances when these plants do get cut down, they still seem to overwinter. The only thing that makes me wonder if there's something to it is like the common butterfly bush, Buddleia, which is a woody perennial, not a herbaceous perennial. If you cut them back, in the fall or late winter, they will die to the ground. The plant won't die, but they'll die to the ground. And so we don't do any hard pruning on Buddleia until late winter, once the worst of winter is past. So maybe there's something to leaving Lantana and some of the salvias that are half-hardy, leave them standing through the winter months. Lantana is not a great beauty in the winter months, but it's okay looking. And I haven't said anything yet about, the wildlife. Any of the things we leave standing can provide shelter for birds and insects and lizards and other creatures that share the garden with us, much more so than if we cut everything to the ground. And birds will make use of the seeds of asters and other plants, and certainly the grasses. So, I did say that the plants will provide shelter for insects. And the thing to remember is that the majority of insects in the garden are either beneficial insects or ones that are neither beneficial or detrimental ones. So the insects that are being sheltered in the leaf litter or in the clumps of herbaceous perennials that haven't been cut down are more than likely of little consequence to the garden. They're not going to be things that are going to prey on the garden. I did bring a few herbaceous perennials out with me. I'm just going to step over here one second. Because we are out here in a full sun garden, I wanted to bring a few examples of herbaceous perennials you might deal with in a shade garden, and I'll pick these up. The same situation applies to the shade garden. There's some things that are really beautiful through the winter months in their winter forms. There are other things that you're going to want to fairly quickly clean up because they're unattractive. There are some shade garden herbaceous perennials that are evergreen, which you'll leave. And And so, just make that call on a plant-by-plant basis. And, always remember it's your garden, so you get to do what you want to do. And in the shade garden, if you herbaceous perennials that disappear come winter months are actually quite pretty in the fall. Common Solomon seal and hostas often turn bright yellow before they totally die away. I'm holding here this little epimedium. It's a species epimedium, Epimedium davidi. And the thing, some epimedium species and hybrids are evergreen and others are deciduous. And you're not going to need to do any online research or drag out a book to figure that out, because the ones that are deciduous are going to be looking rather shabby this time of year. So you can clean them up as soon as you want to. And the evergreen ones are going to look great either all winter or most of the winter. The thing to remember with the evergreen epimediums is, and this would be more on the lines of an actual rule rather than just opinion, is that you'll want to cut the evergreen epimediums down by late winter, because once they start putting up new growth, you can still cut the old foliage out, but you're going to have to be as precise as a brain surgeon, tracing each leaf back to the ground level and cutting it out. Whereas if you do it late winter before they start putting up new growth, you can quickly just cut the whole plant to the ground. And I didn't bring out a pair of hedge shears, those pruning shears with the long blade, but they're good for cutting down like big broad masses of epimediums if you have one of the types that also spreads. Another group of plants that can be either evergreen or deciduous are the various Solomon seal. And the plants with the common name of Solomon seal fall into various genera. The common Solomon seals are Polygonatum, and they're deciduous. When you get tired of looking at the buff foliage, you can cut it down. It probably just is easily just sort of raked off the plant at that point. But then you have their evergreen cousins, the Dysporopsis. And they are evergreen, but they're sort of like the evergreen epimediums. By late winter, you can cut the foliage down because it's going to die away before they put up new foliage. The foliage only lasts for, a whole 12 months or so. So by late winter, you can cut it down and then it's out of the way when they put up new growth. And the same can be said of ferns. Ferns are a big component of many shade gardens. And there are some ferns that are sun-loving, but mostly they're shade garden plants. And some are evergreen and some are deciduous. But like the other two plants I just spoke about, the evergreen ones, most of those, by the time they start putting up new foliage in the spring, the old foliage is looking real tatty. And it's a whole lot easier to cut it down before it's putting up new growth. So by late winter, you can cut those down. But if they're evergreen, you're going to enjoy looking at the foliage through the winter months. Hellebores, the hellebore that is most common in gardens, the Lenten rose, which we used to call Hellebores orientalis, but now know to call Hellebores hybridus, make a huge volume of foliage. Some people will cut away all of the foliage so it's not hiding any of the flowers. The plants are very tolerant of that, and you can do that. I'm a little bit more modest in how much I cut out. I certainly will always recommend cutting out any of the Lenten rose foliage that looks untidy. And you might do that several times over the course of the winter, depending on the severity of the winter. A more severe winter, you'll probably be cutting out more foliage that's been damaged by the cold. But other types of hellebores, like the Christmas rose, Hellebores niger, and some of the hybrids between niger and others, don't make a great deal of foliage. And if it's those, I would recommend not cutting away much foliage at all unless it's late winter and the foliage looks shabby. But some of them make far fewer leaves than the Lenten roses, so don't get too heavy-handed in how much foliage you cut away. And I brought out this plant as a stand-in for Liriope. This is actually Reinecke and not Liriope. Liriope doesn't have to be cut back. I think you would always recommend cutting it back if the foliage has gotten shabby. But I also want to recommend that you don't cut it down until late winter. If some people cut it down this time of year, and then you're looking at cut back foliage all winter, whereas generally the Liriope foliage is handsome all winter long, and often it's only by late winter that it looks shabby enough that you want to cut it down. I like to cut things down so I'm not looking at the cut foliage for longer periods of time than I have to. And things like Aspidistra, generally you don't ever cut them all the foliage off. Just go in there and cut out any foliage that is tired, because the youngest foliage, will probably still look good, but the foliage that is now 2 or 3 years old will start looking tired by time they get to that age. Here we have Hibiscus. This is Hibiscus grandiflorus, which is a native species. And they look a little shabby at this point because they're still hanging on to leaves, but they'll be shed fairly quickly. And the stems will bleach out and be a nice silvery white. And so we leave them. And the seed heads are pretty too. You can see, they do resemble a bit like okra, same family, but the seed heads open up and look like stars. There's lots of seed in there, so we leave all of that all winter long. And then late winter, before things start to, before they start putting up new growth, we'll cut those stems down. And the stems are sort of spongy, and pruning shears tend to just sort of mush them, and it's one that I find it's much easier to cut with the saw blade. Just 1 or 2 draws on the with the saw, and you can cut those stems to the ground. I'm standing right here by this autumn sage, Salvia microphylla. And it's really not, it's not a herbaceous perennial. It's a little shrub or subshrub. But I will mention that we do cut it back every year, but not till late winter. And I certainly wouldn't cut it down this early. I don't know if you see this honeybee there. Earlier, there's a big fat bumblebee on it. So these flowers have been a little bit damaged by cold, but the bees are still nectaring on them. Oh, chrysanthemums. We grow quite a few different chrysanthemums. Mostly these single daisy type mums. And, we never have any trouble with them overwintering. Most of them are so vigorous that every year or so we have to, reduce the amount of area that they've taken over. So once they're done blooming, we tend to cut them down because they're not really all that attractive once they're done blooming. The foliage is handsome through the summer months. They're really pretty in bloom, and these late season bloomers are really good for pollinators, especially monarchs that are fueling up to fly to Mexico. But as I said, we never have trouble with them overwintering. I grew up in northeastern New Jersey near New York City back when winters were very cold, and my mom had 2 different chrysanthemums that, I grew up with, and, they had no trouble overwintering there. So if you plant cushion mums, very often they don't overwinter. They weren't really bred for being a long-term perennial in the garden. They were bred for exactly what you bought them for, to make a nice, full flowering plant in a pot to buy in the fall. A lot of them, I've planted so many of them over the decades, but a lot of them do not perennialize, if I can use that verb form of a noun. Okay. Oh, here's one plant that is so beautiful in the winter months. This is the seed heads of Lilium Formosainum. They do have a huge number of seeds. I don't know if you can see the seeds. They're sort of like the size and shape of oatmeal, rolled oats. But the seed pods are beautiful all winter long. Always disappointed when they get cut down too soon. But the seeds blow away on the wind, and Lilium Formosainum is a species that does extremely well for us. All the seedlings come up in a lot of places where we can't use them, like in the middle of a sidewalk or something, but when they come up in the garden, we really enjoy them. How are we doing for time? What? Okay. Yeah, I think it's probably a good point to open up for questions, because people might have a lot of them.
Okay. We've talked about answered a lot of things, but I want to get your input on some of them that we've answered, because you may answer differently, because people do different things.
Happy to.
This isn't really a herbaceous perennial, but there is a question about pruning back blueberries and raspberries.
Blueberries and raspberries require very different pruning. And the blackberry world has gotten a little bit more complicated with these ones that produce several times over the course of the summer. And I don't have any experience with them, but raspberries and blackberries, once a cane has borne fruit, it is cut to the ground, and you only retain the new shoots that were produced that summer, and those are the ones that will flower and fruit next year. So raspberries and blackberries, the canes are sort of annual canes, but they're always replaced by new ones. Blueberries are, have permanent stems. And when I've worked with blueberries, and it was always on a small scale, I sort of continued to prune them over the course of the summer. If they're growing vigorously, what you're leaving is all the strongest new shoots, which are thick and unbranched largely, and cutting away older side branches and stuff that have borne fruit and are now sort of scrawny and stuff. So it's much more like pruning many of the deciduous flowering shrubs, like a spirea or a forsythia, where you're most often not cutting a whole stem to the ground, but just cutting the older parts back, which will promote new growth, and those new vigorous stems are what will flower and fruit next year.
A question that wasn't really asked in here, but it's one that I've been getting asked about more and more as they've become popular again, are red hot pokers, Nephofia.
Okay. That's a good one to ask, because they will retain an awful lot of green foliage through the winter months that's sort of sloppy. And we tend to This time of year, we would tend to cut it back quite a bit just because it's usually swamping their neighbors. But by late winter, when they start putting up new growth, then we tend to strip away all the old foliage and leaving just the new foliage that is coming up at that time of the year. The red hot pokers or the nymphophillas are as Mr. Canopphia pronounced his name. And they're good herbaceous perennials for summer color.
Somebody asked about Joe Pyweed.
We often leave Joe Pyweed standing through the winter months. It still has, the big, what was the big head of purple flowers is now a big head of seeds. And we do get some seedlings from it, but not an excessive number. You could always spray paint it if you want to.
This is one that's kind of has a similar answer than for something that you already talked about, but spider lilies.
Spider lilies. Spider lilies can either be Lycoris or Hymenocallis. Spider lilies, the Lycoris are late summer, early fall blooming bulbs, and there's usually nothing to clean up on them. When they're done blooming, most of them don't set fruit, so the old flower stalks just collapse and you could clean them up, but then the foliage is, depending on the type, will either come up in the fall or wait until the spring. And it's sort of like dealing with daffodil foliage. Leave it alone until it starts to yellow and then you can strip it away. Native asters, many of them are really pretty in the winter. They're a lot like their cousin, the ironweeds, in that initially they're little like dandelion tufts of seeds, but then when they disappear, you have the receptacle or the bracts, the bracts that look sort of star-like, just like the flowers. Aster referring to stars, like in astronomy. So most of our native asters I would leave for winter interest. Remember that the climbing aster is a woody vine, and so you can cut it to the ground, but you don't really want to, because then you will lose the height that it's gained over the course of the summer. So leave them until they look shabby. The beautiful little white woodland aster, Aster divaricata, is okay for winter interest, but I think its strongest winter aspect is its beautiful foliage, which carpets the ground.
Chris answered this somewhat. He answered it online, but I'd like to get your input.
Sure.
Because this is a bigger a big pruning topic. Kind of is iris.
Okay. Iris fairy. The genus Iris is huge. This time of year, Dutch iris are starting to put up their foliage. We saw some yesterday when we were cutting down some cannas. The Dutch iris foliage is about 6 inches tall and will continue to grow all winter long. And by time spring gets here, the foliage will be, this tall and arching over to the ground. Many other irises are completely dormant. Louisiana iris, I'm going to take a few steps this way. There's a big mass of, I'll cut some stems and bring it to you. All right. This is Iris virginica, a native iris, as you'd imagine, with the specific epithet Virginica, referring to Virginia. And Louisiana iris does this even more prominently, where the oldest foliage is shabby, the summer's foliage is shabby, so we'll strip it away. And then just leave the new foliage, which will be green all winter. And it's perhaps a slower process to strip away the foliage, but you end up with a much tidier appearance than if you cut them back. And when I was a little kid, my mom sent us outside to cut the bearded irises down, but I hate when that gets done, because when you cut the foliage down, you're going to be looking at this cut edge for months. So my preference is to just strip away the old foliage. And I'll point out the beautiful fuchsia purple base to the foliage on these Iris virginica. So, again, and some irises are fully evergreen, like Iris unguicularis, the Algerian iris, which starts blooming about now and blooms through the winter months, is evergreen. And the stinking Gladwin Iris fetidissima is evergreen. Iris japonica, not to be confused with the Japanese iris, is evergreen. Though if we have a whole cold winter, it can get damaged by the cold, but certainly in a mild winter, it's evergreen. So, take a moment before you do anything and just look at the iris, and it'll probably tell you whether it's tired old foliage that you need to cut to the ground or strip away, or whether it's going to be evergreen. You can't treat different members of the genus Iris the same way. So take them on a case-by-case basis. The only time I do think it a good practice to cut the foliage back is if you're transplanting iris that have really big foliage. I do cut them back then, because when you replant them, they don't need this 18-inch tall sail to catch the wind and blow them out of the ground. But other than that, I don't like cutting the foliage back. I like stripping it off. I hope that answered their question.
I think so. Looks like we've gotten to the questions now. I want to thank everybody for joining us. Once again, I hope you all have a fantastic Thanksgiving weekend, and thank y'all all for joining us and participating. And feel like I'm thankful for all these new friends that I've made. So we will see you next week. And if you have any other questions, you're always feel free to get in touch with us. And remember to go to YouTube if you watch these on YouTube, and subscribe to our feed, and like our programs, because it does help other folks see us. And if you like what we do, whether you're here in town or farther away, we hope that you'll become a member and help support us. We are working hard to make sure that we have benefits and advantages for people wherever they live. And somebody put on in the chat, Happy Plantsgiving. I love that. I'm gonna start saying that to people. Sure. Y'all have a Happy Plantsgiving as well. Thanks very much.